We do a great job of making sure that people have the immediate needs to what's going wrong. I'm sure that many of you all have probably heard this story that I've learned from J. Alfred Smith that I'll share today. It's an African proverb where one villager shows up outside the river and he sees a baby in the river. That villager jumps into the river and gets the baby out. The next day, there are 2 babies in the river. That villager, along with another person, jump into the river to get those 2 babies out. The next day, there are 3 babies in the river. They recruit more people. They jump in the river to get the babies out. The next day, 4 babies, then 5 babies, then 6 babies, then 7 babies. You all get how the story's working now? They keep jumping into the rivers to grab the babies out. And then finally, some smart sister, you know it's always a sister, who says, how about I go upstream to see how they're getting in the river in the first place? When we talk about social justice, we are talking not about downstream interventions. We are talking about upstream solutions. We have to. Now, the reality is we all know that we have to jump into the river. Because babies are dying now. People are dying now. Single mothers are dying now. Elders are dying now. But somebody needs to be the voice, the person, the reality that says we're going upstream to see how the babies are getting in the water in the first place. Charity is committed to the work of figuring out how to help people in the here and now. And we need that. But we also need people who are willing to go upstream and figure out how it's happening in the first place. We are the people who are interested in causation. We're not Band-Aid providers. Your communities, wherever you are located, they need you to be willing to do some upstream ministry. Downstream ministry is handing out backpacks. Upstream ministry is telling your local senator, your state senator, that schools need to be fully funded. Downstream ministry is making sure that you have long food lines. But upstream ministry is asking the question, why does hunger exist in the first place? Downstream ministry says that you will make sure that parents are plugged into the education process. But upstream ministry is you going to the school board making sure that there are no punitive, hyper-disciplinary processes that are targeting black and brown girls. Y'all get what I'm saying? That as black churches, we cannot simply do downstream ministry. We have to figure out what it means to go upstream and ask ourselves the question of what's getting in the way of us and everybody having what they need. Now, this requires you to be willing to be on the outs with people with power. You know, I've learned, Dr. Stewart, that we are more interested in invitations to give benedictions at inaugurations than we actually are in protecting and saving the butts of the people who sit in our pews. Is that we are in the middle of what may be the greatest crisis in of our time, right? I was going to be a little more extreme than that, but I'll stick there. The greatest crisis of our time. We are living with a pandemic that is not over, contrary to how we may feel. We are living on the brink of another world war because Putin may just use chemical warfare. We are in the middle of what is a 4-century-long attack on black bodies. Every week, there's another black unarmed person who's being gunned down by police. And just because you don't hear about it doesn't mean it didn't happen. Every week, there's an all-white jury somewhere in this country. Every week, there are black girls who are being suspended at 3 times the rate as white girls. And let's be clear, according to the numbers, these are dark-skinned black girls that are being suspended. That's why I'm grateful that, that Ketanji is going through the process to be nominated for the Supreme Court, because it is important that we honor the fact that colorism has been a problem for black people and black churches. I need to be honest. We got to be honest about that. That it is not simply anti-blackness that exists outside the church, but it is anti-darkness that has existed within the church. I have an abolitionist friend. Her name is Rebecca Wilcox, and she goes by the name Raw, and she is Raw. But Raw is under the impression that the black church needs to be abolished. I don't agree with her on that, but she agrees that she says that the black church needs to be abolished. And she talks about the black church as just another American institution. And I want to say to us today here at Lott, Carey, we need to be careful about the sedation of assimilation. We've become way too American. Now, I know. We fought for this country. We vote in this country. We pay taxes to this country. But at some point, we have to ask ourselves the question, have we become so American that we can't even allow ourselves to be Christian? James Baldwin says, I cannot pledge allegiance to a flag that has not pledged allegiance to us. We consistently show ourselves to be hyper-American, and I know there are many, I know we love this country. I know. It is clear that we love this country. But is it possible that we've become way too American that we don't allow ourselves to do ministry? Because ministry cannot simply be how great our Zooms are. Ministry cannot just be, and this is about hybrid church. I know it, I get it, I love it. But we cannot allow ourselves to have highly produced worship service while people are dying everywhere around us. How American have we become? To the point that we don't have the courage to speak truth about a nation that refuses to be what it says it is on paper. When we do upstream ministry, when we do social justice ministry, we are saying, America, just be true to what you say you are on paper. Because that's Dr. King, right? The paper version of America is safe. The paper version of America is lovable. The paper version of America is true. The paper version of America is the land of the free and the home of the brave. But the actual America is killing black bodies on a daily basis. Your Zooms, as great as they may be, are not keeping people from being killed by a system that's throwing us into the water. And charity is not the answer. Social justice is. Abolition is. When I talk about abolition, an abolitionist approach to crisis necessitates that we pursue what is known as the Sankofa ethic. When you have a Sankofa ethic, and I hope there are people in here who still love Africa, and not just love Africa to the point that, you know, we send water and rice, but we actually love Africa because it's our homeland, right? I hope we have not forgotten that Africa really is home, right? There's in African traditions, right? Particularly one, there is the Sankofa ethic. This is a bifocal practice of looking backwards in order to look forward. That we have to have the capacity to look backwards without becoming victims to the tyranny of nostalgia. Everybody here, we love Dr. King, we love Rosa Parks, but there's a sense that we have over-romanticized what happened in the 1950s and 60s. We gotta be honest about this. Taylor Branch says this, and it hurt my heart when I read Taylor Branch say this, is only about 5% of the black church was engaged in the civil rights movement. Now, I know all of us know some older black people who claim we marched with King, we supported King, we uplifted King, but the reality is only 5% of black folk, particularly black faith folk, were invested in the civil rights movement. Which means 95% of black faith folk were not engaged in the work that Dr. King was waging in order to reshape the nature of the country. I want us to sit with that, because we like to claim that we are the inheritors of a civil rights tradition, when the reality is that most of us were not engaged. Most of us were not committed to it. This may be an inside reference, but most of us stayed with J.H. Jackson and the National Baptist Convention, and we didn't go to progressive with Daddy King and Gardner Taylor and the others who made this work possible. Now, I was raised NBC, but I got to be honest about this. Most of us stayed with J.H. Jackson, who was anti-involvement in the civil rights movement. So when we look backwards, we have to be honest about what we're looking at. Is that there has always only been a small number of people who have been willing to say, America, you've never been great. There have only been a small number of us who've been willing to say, America, you've never been true to what you say you are on paper. When I talk about abolitionism, I want us to know that, one, it's an intersectional movement. We don't just, black churches have been really good about race and been really bad about everything else. You know, I thank God for this convention, but black churches still get gender wrong. We have a woman who's a president, but there's still so many black churches who don't have women who can preach. Now, this may be more of a toe stepper, is that we still have people who say women can only be deaconesses, and I love deaconesses. My grandma was a deaconess, but women can only be deaconesses but cannot be deacons. At some point, we need to do a physical of our churches. There needs to be a spiritual diagnosis of who we actually are. And maybe our civil rights bona fides are not as high as we think they are. We need churches that are committed to abolition. When I talk about abolition, I am conjuring I'm bringing into reality. I'm hoping that we are hearing that we need more Brush Harbor churches and less plantation churches. I call it Brush Harbor spirituality versus plantation religion. There are enough churches out here who still keep alive the details and the reality of plantation religion. This is what I love about your ancestors, my ancestors, is that they, on their only day off, and it was not really a day off, on Sundays, they were willing, after they had church with Massa, they were willing to wake up, go into the clearing, into the brush harbor, into the place of the woods in order to practice what Dr. King calls some somebodyness. They were willing to practice the ring shout, the Africanisms. They were willing to go into the woods and declare that they were human and they were alive. How many of our churches are just replications of plantation life? And how many of our churches are really brush harbors for people who are victims of America every single day? We need brush harbor churches. People who get their butts whipped. Remember, my student said, we need you to save my butt, not save my soul. Right? People who get their butts whipped at school, on jobs, in court, at banks, every single week need a brush harbor. I love that Toni Morrison in her book Beloved has Baby Suggs, who is the preacher there, who says in the clearing, in the brush harbor, she tells those black people, love your unnoosed neck. That's what black church ought to be. It ought to be a place of a counter narrative, a counter story, not a place that replicates and reifies the very same Americanness that is hurting black people on a daily basis. There is the sedation of assimilation that we have to address. So when I think about abolition, I'm thinking about the word. Now, we talk about a lot of white abolitionists, but I need us to remember that abolition was really the work of black folk. It was black people who escaped from plantations. Y'all remember? Y'all remember that Harriet Tubman says, "I would have freed more black people if they only knew they were slaves." There's at least one black person on the Supreme Court that might not know. That's why we need Ketanji, right? That's why we need her on the Supreme Court, because the black seat has been occupied too long by somebody that Harriet Tubman might say not know who they really are. Right? I'm really sorry to say that. But abolitionism has always been the work of black folk, particularly black faith folk. And so I think about abolition, the ways we do abolition. I wrote a chapter in a book called Abolitionist Leadership by one of my best friends. The book is written by one of my best friends, Robert Harvey, but I wrote the second chapter in that book, which is a history of abolition. And in that book, I distill abolition down to at least, and obviously I know I missed some, but at least 3 practices. So if we want to be abolitionists, and I really hope we do, is that we have to, as churches, be engaged in at least these 3 abolitionist practices. Can I give these to you? All right. The first abolitionist practice that I think is important is what I call the personalization of public policy. Public policy is not just political, it's personal. What our legislators on the state level, on the local level, and on the federal level pass actually impacts our kitchen table. How much money you make is really an issue of public policy. How much money you get in Social Security is really an issue of public policy. We always ask the question, why don't young black people vote? We always ask that. How can we get young black people to vote? Well, maybe we should start talking about public policy as personal and not just political. If we really want to impact this 2022 midterm election, we have to learn as churches not to just talk about, well, we ought to vote because our ancestors died for it. And that's a good reason to vote. But unfortunately, people my age and younger, they don't really care about that. It just is what it is. But how do we make public, and let's also be clear, there are a lot of senior citizens that don't vote too. There are a lot of white senior citizens that don't vote too. And I only bring that into the topic today because we are so hard on black people when actually per capita we vote at a higher rate than white people. Right? Not the same numbers because we only make up 13% of the country, but black folk actually do vote at a high percentage. The question is, can we get more black folk to vote so that we can actually run this country? I think that's another question that we have to ask ourselves. But black folk actually do vote. So don't be hard. When November comes around, October, November comes around, don't be hard on your congregations, on your ministries, on your leaders about voting, because black church folk vote at a higher rate than any people in this country. Right? The people in your pews are actually voting. It's the people outside your church that you need to get to vote. Right? There 98% of my church is registered to vote. And I'm sure those numbers are true for all of us. If you did the work to see if you signed up for the van, that's what they call it, the van. If you signed up for the van and you looked at your numbers, I'm pretty sure that you are in the 90 percentile of how many people in your church are registered to vote. The problem is not necessarily what's within our church. The problem is what's around our church. But we are not going to mobilize people unless we learn that policy has to be personalized. Secondly, not only does policy have to be personalized, but there's also the relational, there has to be relational community organizing. We have to be interested and willing to create relationship with people we don't know. Now, I heard Brianna say this yesterday in a different way. I heard Dr. Shepard say this in a different way, is that we actually have to be willing to create relationship with people that don't talk like us. And when I say talk like us, I'm talking about Christianese. We have to be willing to break up our nostalgia and stop saying that what people should come to church and just accept the fact that they're not coming. And and I know that's hard. But when I say accepting the fact that they're not coming, I'm not saying stop doing evangelism, because I know we love evangelism. When I say accept the fact that they're not coming, I'm saying accept the fact that we have to go to them. Are we willing to go to people that we believe are unsavable? Are we willing to put our reputations on the line for people that we have categorized as unlovable? Community organizing is not about us cheerleading to the crowd that we already know, right? So many of our church, many of us, when we talk about church growth, most of what we mean when we mean church growth is how do we get other people's members? That's why we like when people stand in front of the church and say their names and what church they came from. I don't think anybody in here still does that, right? But you all know when I grew up in Galveston, Texas, at the First Union Baptist Church, is that everybody who joined the church had to say that they were coming by Christian experience. And if you came by, or you just came, maybe you were just one of those sinners who finally found God late in your life. But most people who came to my church in Galveston, Texas, came by Christian experience, which means they had to announce what church they came from. When we talk about community organizing, we are not just talking about how we relate to people who are already saved. How do we engage people who we have deemed as unsavable, as unlovable, and unwanted, right? There has to, and community organizing has to be about relationship building. Right? And I got to push on. But so you have the personalization of public policy, you have the relationalization of community organizing, but there's also the democratization of artistic power. All of our churches are what they are because there's a good choir or a good praise team. How do we begin to use art as a way of shifting consciousness? How do we use our singing in church, not simply for spiritual gratification and a shout, but how does the music in our church become a part of the education process? How do we use our music as a way of telling our story? That music cannot just be about how we feel, and I'm only talking about music as one form of art, but I think that we are musical organizations. How does our music begin to tell the story of our freedom? That's why I still love the spirituals. Because the spirituals were not simply about how do we connect with God through song, but remember, our spirituals were what was known as the double entendre. That as they were singing "Swing Low, Sweet Chariot, Coming Forth to Carry Me Home," they were also telling a message about how you can get on the Underground Railroad. We hate rap. I'm tired of church folk talking about how bad rap is, when gospel music ain't that much better. Well, our hymns ain't that much better. How is our music still telling the story of our freedom? Is our music telling us how to get to heaven, or is our music telling us how to survive the hell we experience down here? We have to accept as church folk that all of us are artists in different ways. You are creative more than you think you are. And in your creativity, you have to be able, you have to have the power and the capacity to tell the story about what we have to do as freedom fighting, as justice agenda people. How are we using art, music, preaching? How are we using our art as a way of advancing the movement agenda? Very necessary questions that we must ask. So there's abolition as personal. What made Frederick Douglass so powerful was that Frederick Douglass was bold enough to tell his story. We cannot be ashamed of what this country has done to us. We have to be able to tell our story. That you get the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment because Frederick Douglass was on the, and others, right? There's Frederick Douglass, there's also Mum Bet, who many of us may not know about, but it's Mum Bet who actually sues the state of Massachusetts and ends slavery because she decided to tell her story before the court of law. Policy, going back, policy has to be personal. It has to have the capacity to tell your story. And hear this, you have to believe that your story may be the story that breaks the back of the system. All right, let me push. There's a brother by the name of Jonathan Walker. He's a white man, actually, who was an abolitionist, and he was captured in the middle of trying to help slaves escape. Because he was white, I'm sure that's why he wasn't killed. And he had branded on him the letters SS. And SS meant slave stealer. But black folk brought him in and changed his SS as slave stealer to SS as slave savior. Now, I have a big problem with calling a white person a savior. I don't like that, right? That's why I had to take white Jesus down in my church, because I don't believe in a white savior. But I think the story has power because it reminds us that we can actually not do the work of abolition and do the work of social justice without being in relationship with people who are not like us. Here's a white man with full privilege who decides to do life with black people. And my question for us is, how many of us are actually willing to do life with black people? I know we have black churches full of black people, and I'm going to talk about this in a moment, but so many of our black churches are so middle class that we forgot that there really is a underclass of black folk in this country. Are we willing to do life with people with their pants sagging? Are we willing to do life with women who we have labeled as baby mamas? Are we willing to do life with people who are easily unemployable because of tattoos and the like, right? We have to ask ourselves as the church, are we so invested in the respectability politics that we don't make space for people like Claudette Colvin, who actually sat down on a bus before Rosa Parks? Or are we only committed to middle-class black folk who fit our image, right? Community organizing as relational is about going to the people who are not like us, the other. The reason why many of us don't know the name Claudette Colvin is because she was a single mother. A young single mother. Thank you, President. Right? She was a teenage mother. And the movement decided we can't use her because she doesn't fit our description. And so the only reason why you know Rosa Parks is she was a fierce woman, no question about that. And she wasn't as passive as many of us like to believe she was passive, right? But Rosa Parks was a fighter. Rosa Parks was a warrior. In fact, Rosa Parks, one of my mentors, Virgil Wood, who is 91 years old now, and he was one of the lieutenants of the civil rights movement. He said Rosa Parks told him that she actually preferred Malcolm over Martin. That may be a surprise. But what I'm trying to get underneath that is that we know Rosa Parks, but we don't know Claudette Colvin because we practice a politics of respectability that needs people to fit a particular bill in order for us to stand up for them. When are we going to start standing up for the people who are guilty? Anybody have prison ministry at your church? If you have a prison ministry, this means that you are invested in the guilty. You're invested in the alienated. You're invested in those who are left behind. That's what community organizing has to be about. Let me push. And then I talked about the artistic persuasion. James Baldwin and Phyllis Wheatley are part of that artistic tradition that we should celebrate that does the work of abolition, right? And there are people in your pews who have artistic capacities that you have to amplify in order to advance your movement, advance your cause, right? Let me push. How much time do I have, Prez? My time's up? Oh, goodness. Okay, let me do this. Let me 10? Okay, let me do this. Let me say some things, and then I want to describe some things, right? When I talk about abolitionist spirituality, I am talking about an imaginative embodiment of the God of freedom's vision for this world. That we are not just created in the image of a God, we are created in the image of the God of freedom. You all do realize that Judaism, which is the parent of Christianity, we're all clear that Jesus wasn't Christian, right? Okay, just want to make sure. Jesus was a Jew, right? And Jewish Jesus was, he was born a Jew, he worshiped as a Jew, he died as a Jew. Jewish Jesus actually had a religion that started with a political event. Christianity comes from a religion that starts from a political event. The Exodus is not spiritual, the Exodus is political. The Exodus is the emancipation of black people. Yes, black people too. The Exodus is the emancipation of Hebrew people. Jesus is a part of a religion that starts with a political event that emancipates people from chattel slavery in Egypt. So there is no separation of the political and the spiritual. They're always tied together in the mind of Jesus. That's why Jesus, when he decided to preach his first sermon, pulled from Isaiah and said, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me to set the captive free." That there is no separation. Don't let those evangelicals tell you otherwise. There is no separation between the political and the spiritual in the mind of Jesus. As Jesus followers, you are the beneficiaries and the ancestors and the followers of a man who was born of a teenage mother, a man who was an infant refugee. He had to leave his own home to escape the murderous threats of a ruler. Jesus was hunted down by the religious elite and the local police. You are the beneficiaries and the ancestors and the students of a man who died the death of the empire. Jesus went to trial. He had no public defender. He lost the trial. He was executed by his governor. You cannot be Christian without being on the side of people who are victims of the criminal justice system, because Jesus was a victim of the criminal justice system. Okay. All right. So, here are 5 things that I need you to know. And I'm just going to say them because I don't have time. Maybe a Q&A we can talk about it. If there's Q&A. I took too much time and we started late. Right. So you have to have a daily preference for the unprotected. As churches, you have to have a daily preference for the unprotected. You have to be committed to people who don't have anything to offer you. You need secondly, you need a sacred intolerance to iniquity, to the iniquity of inequity. Injustice is sin. We cannot just talk about the slavery of sin without talking about the sin of slavery. You cannot talk about the sin, the wages of sin or death, without talking about the sin of poverty wages. You cannot talk about people being captives of sin without talking about people who are captive to a system that is designed to keep them trapped in poverty. Right? That we have to talk about sin as systemic and not just individual. Don't just talk about who's sleeping with whom, who's drinking what. You have to also talk about the sins of systems and states and structures, right? So you have to have a sacred intolerance to inequity. There has to be an urgent disruption of structures. We cannot wait. The unflinching tyranny of time demands that we do something now. Right? We have to do the work of repairing, this is the next one, repairing the harm to minds and bodies. That's why your church has to be brush harbors. I love yesterday that Tanika talked to us about how do we create sacred space. How do we become sacred space? Because the people who enter your church with harm. Right? And there has to be a daily renewal of counter imagination. That we as the people of Jesus must have an imagination. We can't just be people of reflection. We have to be people of imagination. Let me say this, and let me run through this, and then I'm done, President. I'm done. But I have to do this. Thank you. Anybody know anything about issues? Name some of the issues that are in your community. Poverty, good. What's another issue? Gentrification, What's another issue? Say it again. Homelessness. Food insecurity, what's another issue? Gun violence. Okay, that's enough. None of those are issues. Those are problems. Problems are those things that we allow ourselves to talk about that keep us from actually doing something. Poverty is too big that many of us in the face of poverty, we feel defenseless. If we're going to do the work of social justice, we have to learn how to actually cut issues, not just talk about problems. When we talk about cutting issues, when I say cutting issues, I'm saying doing something that is actionable, not something that is big and overwhelming. Racism is big, it's overwhelming. We tell ourselves that we cannot fix it. It cannot be achieved. It cannot be done. But we are asking ourselves right now in this moment that we cannot simply complain and talk about problems. We have to learn how to cut some issues. When you cut an issue, you are saying, one, that it's actionable. There's something you can actually do about it. So racism is the problem, but an issue you can do something about is actually police brutality in the neighborhood that is most black in your community. So when you cut an issue, you are distilling the problem down to something you can do today. Y'all hearing me right there? Does that make sense? And what that requires is, who's responsible for racism? You can't identify somebody who's responsible for racism, can you? But you can identify somebody who's responsible for suspending black girls at a high rate. When you cut an issue, you are saying to yourself and to your community that you are going to hold somebody responsible for a particular issue. Many of our churches, and I'm done, many of our churches, we have not made an imprint in the work of social justice because we have been talking about problems instead of actually addressing issues. If you want to fix something in your community, obviously we cannot do everything, but every church needs to figure out what your issues are. This requires surveying your community. Write that down. Survey your community. This requires figuring out who's responsible for the issue that you are facing. Targeting somebody. When I say targeting somebody, I mean you have to be willing to be the enemy of people with power. You may not get invited to give the benediction and the evocation and the invocation at the next city council meeting because of this. You have to distill your issue. You have to survey your community. You have to target somebody with power. And then you have to do the work that's in the experience of your people. I need you to hear that. Do something that's in the experience of your people. Do something that your people can do. Your people can march. Your people can write letters. Like, there are things your people, you have to know your people if you really want to do social justice. Sometimes, a march with 30 people is not that impressive. And if people aren't showing up to your marches, maybe marches are not in the experience of your people. So if you want to make a move on an issue that is going to be lasting and beneficial, you have to do something that your people can actually do. And this does not mean beating them on the head because they don't do what you want them to do. This is actually figuring out what your people are willing to do. And it is about confrontation. I call this, and I'm done, I call this the ministry of erosion. The ministry of erosion is that the only way we wear evil down is by showing up over and over and over again. That is what social justice does. It is the capacity to wear evil down by showing up over and over and over and over and over again. One march, one letter campaign, one Twitter campaign is not going to do it. You have to be consistent. Because your opposition is expecting you to lose steam and to lose power, but you got to show up and 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 show up. You have to have the ministry of erosion. Find an issue, target power, make sure that you do something in the experience of your people and do it over and over and over and over again because your mayor expects you to give up before he gives up or she gives up. Amen.